protein is probably the most misunderstood nutrient. But let's get one thing out of the way. It is completely essential. We need it to build muscles, to build cells, to create enzymes and hormones, and to carry oxygen around our bodies. So it is critical. But people usually get way more protein than they need. And an excessive focus on protein, especially animal-based protein, at the expense of other nutrients, can actually be really harmful. Protein has become seemingly untouchable. You can be anti-carb, you can be anti-fat, but no one would dare argue that there's anything wrong with protein. It's omnipresent in pop culture, in fitness, in health advice, in advertising. Whether you listen to your doctor, your favorite influencer, your nutritionist, or your personal trainer, the advice will be much the same. Lots and lots of protein, without much regard for the food that protein actually comes from. It seems we can't get enough of protein, and our insatiable appetite for it, far from making us healthier, is leading us down a very dangerous path. Ask yourself the question, is all this protein that we're eating actually making us healthier? In the words of Dr. Garth Davis in the book Proteinaholic, the fact is, our protein obsession is killing us, and nobody seems to notice. In this video, I want to explore protein with you and uncover some of the myths and misinformation that disrupt our understanding of nutrition where protein is concerned. I hope to make the case that our collective obsession with protein is not only scientifically misguided, it's potentially harmful as well. Let's dive in, friend. I'm Dr. Ryan Williams, your host and the founder of Growing Pure, where I help you achieve health and vitality through delicious vegan food. We have to start, I think, by asking, what is protein and where does it come from? Well, it's a macronutrient. It's a source of calories. It's found in virtually all foods, and it's composed of chains of amino acids. These amino acids, there's an amine component, the amino, and a carboxylic acid component, that's the acid. And these amino acids, think of them like beads on a necklace. Each little bead, each amino acid arranges one next to another, and the entire chain, the entire necklace, is our protein chain. And it's worth pointing out something that may be surprising to you. All protein, all of it, originally comes from plants and bacteria, not from animals. It sounds crazy because we normally associate protein with meat, but in fact, plants are the only things that can synthesize the amino acids we need for protein because they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. Those bacteria allow nitrogen to be gathered from the air and turned into a usable biological format for the plant. The plant can then go on and make its proteins, and then when an animal eats the plant, it rearranges those amino acids and makes its own proteins from them. But what is the problem with protein? Well, in a word, it's confusion. Many people implicitly believe, perhaps even unconsciously to themselves, that eating more protein will help them be healthier, it'll help them live longer, it'll give them more energy, and of course it will give them muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you go to a supermarket or a health store, you will be inundated with products proclaiming their high protein content. You know, cereal bars, shakes, drinks, supplements, breakfast cereals, you name it, there'll be a product that's high protein in it. Now, food companies proclaim their high protein content on their products for one reason. It helps them sell more. Protein has what's referred to as a health halo effect. Just by protein being highlighted as being in a food, we somehow assume that makes it healthier. And this is very powerful. In fact, a survey by the International Food Information Council Foundation found that 63% of Americans are looking for protein when they're trying to decide what foods to eat. And a staggering 57% of Americans are trying to eat as much protein as possible. It's no wonder food companies want to talk about how much protein's in their products. But here's the problem. This health halo effect of protein is not supported by scientific evidence. Even amongst vegan food products, protein has these healthy connotations. And I've been guilty of this myself, right? In some of my previous videos, I've talked about foods like tofu, for instance, being high in protein, as if that automatically makes it a more nutritious food. But I would argue that this obsession with protein is not making us healthier. In fact, it's leading to some of our major chronic diseases, the killers that we're most likely to unfortunately confront in our lifetimes. There is a tremendous amount of misinformation and hearsay around protein. So much so that when we hear the truth, it seems to fly in the face of common sense, of what we hear from influencers and bloggers and even health professionals. So here's the reality. Number one, protein is not the key to weight loss. In fact, animal protein is a major contributor to the obesity epidemic. And studies consistently show that animal foods, animal protein, is associated with weight gain. Number two, animal protein is not one of the healthiest foods around. In fact, study after study implicates it strongly in the leading killers of our time: heart disease, cancers, diabetes, high blood pressure. Number three, plant protein not only exists in plenty of quantity in plant foods to support our needs, it's also much healthier than animal protein. Number four, a low protein diet, not a high protein diet, is actually perhaps the best way to lose weight and to enjoy health and vitality into your old age. Now, there are many studies that support this. I'm not going to have time to go into them in detail in this video, but this video is heavily influenced by this excellent book, Proteinaholic by Dr. Garth Davis. This really does go into the deep science. And of course, I will link all of the sources from that book in the description below. But before I dive into the story of protein a little bit more, I just want to highlight some protein paradoxes. We rarely, if ever, stop to consider these. But if we do, we quickly see that something doesn't add up with the protein story. Firstly, we're told from a very young age that we need to eat lots of protein to grow up big and strong and to grow our muscles. Yet we see that virtually all of the strongest, biggest, most muscular animals get virtually all of their protein from simple plant foods like grasses and fruits and leaves. When was the last time you saw an elephant or a gorilla or a buffalo or a horse tucking into a steak, right? They don't eat that stuff. And yet they're hugely muscular and strong. Clearly they're getting protein from somewhere to build these muscles. And so it must be coming from the simple plant foods that they eat, the grasses and leaves. Most of us don't even think of these foods as having protein in, but clearly they do. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that we're the same as horses or elephants, but evidently we've got to think that there must be plenty of protein to build muscle in these foods. Secondly, we try to eat high protein to both lose weight and to gain weight. Surely someone trying to drop pounds and a bodybuilder trying to put on weight should be eating different things, given that their goals are exactly opposite. But no, the food industry has convinced us that more and more protein is always the answer. And so the same thing that food companies will sell to someone trying to slim down and get that bikini body is relabeled and repackaged and sold to, a gym bro trying to get as much muscle on as fast as they can. How does that make any sense? Thirdly, given protein's undoubted importance in growth, it stands to reason that the time when protein is most vital, when we need the most of it, is when we're growing fastest. This is, of course, when we're babies. At no other time in our life will we grow even close to as fast as we do when we're small babies. And yet, human breast milk has the lowest concentration of protein of just about any mammal milk tested at just 8.5 grams per litre. Compare that with cow's milk, which has over 3 times the concentration of protein, or rat's milk, which has over 10 times as much protein. And bear in mind here that human breast milk is this perfectly created food that evolution has perfected over millions of years to try and grow a human baby in the most efficient way possible. Surely this should throw into doubt the notion that more protein is always better. The final protein paradox I want you to think of here is, when was the last time you heard of a friend or a family member being rushed into hospital with a serious case of protein deficiency? Or, okay, let's lower the bar a little bit. What about just your friend is not feeling very well, and you've heard someone has gone to the doctor, said, "I'm not feeling well, doc, what's wrong with me?" And they've come away and said, "Oh, you've got a serious case of protein deficiency." I don't know anyone like that. I've never heard of that. Have you? Tragically, I've known all too many people who've been diagnosed with horrible conditions like cancer and dementia and heart disease. And when it comes to deficiency, sure, I've known people who have had iron deficiency, they've been anemic, or they've been low in iodine and they've had thyroid problems, or they've even been low in vitamin D. That last one was actually me about 6 years ago. But protein deficiency? Common sense tells us it's unknown. And yet still, influencers and fitness people and even nutritionists and doctors will talk at length that you've got to get more and more protein, as if it's this thing that we're so close to being completely deficient in. So at this point, surely alarm bells should be ringing about the supposed status of protein as a nutrient of deficiency concern. Surely this should start to make us think, well, hang on, why are we focusing so much on protein when clearly there are other illnesses that are really happening to people that I know? So how did we become so confused about protein? To really understand protein and how it usurped the throne as undisputed king of the nutrients, we need to look at its history a little bit. We need to understand the context that early research on protein was being done in. And we need to understand the market forces that shaped the public's perception of protein. And that will give us a lens through which we can better understand protein. So throughout history, the vast majority of people, through sheer necessity, have eaten a plant-predominant, plant-based diet. They've had things like potatoes, grains like rice or oats or barley, or beans even. Most people could not afford meat, and meat's not that easy to catch or to grow. Now, hundreds of years ago, only a few people could afford to eat meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. And these were the very, very rich people. These people at sort of king and queen status were the ones who became overweight. So in this context, for the vast majority of people, starvation is a real concern because there aren't enough calories to go around. And so animal protein becomes associated with prestige and wealth and luxury because only the very rich can afford it. Additionally, we've got to recall that for the vast majority of human history, we lived in an environment of extreme scarcity. Life expectancy was very short, and our biggest killers, far from being the chronic diseases of today, tended to be things like infectious diseases. Cholera, dysentery, influenza, smallpox, sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, these were the killers. So in this context, animal protein must have seemed like a superfood. It must have seemed incredible. And I'd argue, in that context, it is a health food. Because it's very calorically rich, it's going to give you that extra bit of body fat you need to survive periods of starvation or the long, harsh winters. And that extra body fat could be the difference between life and death if you contract a serious infection and you need to fight it off. With life expectancy being as short as it was, even at the turn of the 20th century, in the United States, the life expectancy was only about 46. And so chronic diseases like your cancer and heart disease and strokes, these take decades to develop. So they're not something you're going to worry about when most people aren't even going to live long enough to suffer the consequences of these animal protein-rich foods. And so it's in this context that the early research on human physiology takes place in the late 16 and early 1700s. Scientists of the day discovered that most of our bodily tissues, our skin and organs and muscles, are in fact made up of protein. And this is even indicated in the name protein. It comes from the Greek word proteos, meaning of prime importance. And so, observing that we are made primarily of protein, they come to the plausible but ultimately incorrect conclusion that we need to be eating lots of protein to maintain that. So we have these three key factors that really shape early society's perceptions of protein. Firstly, meat promotes excess weight and body fat, which is very, very handy in times of scarcity. Secondly, only the rich could afford meat, which gives it a prestigious, opulent sort of status. And thirdly, our bodies are made of meat, so surely we need to be eating meat to replenish that. And so you can imagine with these ideas that protein could easily be seen as the king of nutrients. Of course, today our health environment has changed, thankfully. We've seen widespread public health measures and the invention of vaccines and antibiotics, which have made infectious diseases manageable. They're no longer the scourge of humanity like they were for so much of our species' history. So instead today, the real killers are the chronic diseases. And of course, we no longer live in times of scarcity. In fact, much of the world has the opposite problem: too much plenty. Now, most anyone can get their hands on cheap, readily accessible animal protein, and it is fueling our biggest killers. And so we see that a set of beliefs around protein that once served us really well are now leading us astray. But there's another piece to this puzzle. Beginning largely after World War II, we experienced something that our species had never really known before: an abundance, a surplus of calories that were readily accessible year-round. And so in this environment, industry had an incentive to capitalize on protein's growing reputation and market and sell their products, their excess calories that they had to offer people. Over the years, a collaborative effort between governments and the food industry has really cemented the idea of lots and lots of protein being critical for good health. And of course, animal protein being the most superior form of protein you can get your hands on.
Real milk has 8 times more protein than almond milk.
The taste you love is also a good source of things you need, like iron, protein.
No, the meat's the real superhero around here.
Decades of marketing by industry have linked meat and protein so intricately in the public zeitgeist that most people no longer know or care that protein doesn't even come originally from animals. But of course, whilst all this was happening, more and more research was actually coming out showing the deleterious health effects of all this consumption of animal protein. And honestly, I kind of have to admire it. There must be a skill involved in managing to convince pretty much the whole world that if they don't buy your products, they'll become frail and weak, even whilst there are mountains of scientific evidence contradicting that. And so we were left with a series of implicit assumptions that are rarely explicitly stated, but are seemingly embedded into everyone. Firstly, protein is the most important nutrient. Secondly, more protein is always better. And thirdly, we're in real danger of not getting enough protein. The problem with these conclusions is quite simply that they're wrong. But that brings me on to the next logical question here. How much protein do healthy people actually eat? Now, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that across much of the Western world, we are not getting healthier. Chronic diseases are at epidemic levels of things like obesity and cancers and diabetes. You would hope that if protein was so healthy that it would be helping us, but it doesn't seem to be. In the United States, the average percentage of our calories that come from protein is around about 15 to 20%. But if you follow a low-carb, high-protein diet, it could easily be 40%. But many of the healthiest populations average only about 10% of their calories coming from protein. Take the blue zones, for example, these longevity hotspots where people live to age 100 at higher rates than anywhere else in the world. I actually did a video all about them. You can watch it up here if you would like. But places like Okinawa in Japan, they average just 7% of their calories coming from protein, and yet they were one of the healthiest, longest living populations ever studied. Looking back through history, we see that all peoples that were able to truly flourish did so on a low protein diet. Whether we look at the Incas or the Aztecs of South America, the Far East or the Middle East, or even parts of Africa, it's always starchy foods like grains and potatoes that were the fuel. Indeed, Dr. Davis in Proteinaholic sums it up quite nicely. He says, "The unarguable fact is, no culture in human history has truly thrived on a high-protein, meat-based diet." Now, I would say this doesn't conclusively prove that animal protein is harmful, although it is certainly suggestive of it. But I think it does prove that lots of protein is clearly not required to thrive. So animal protein is not a health food. Many studies of all types, mechanistic studies, test tube or sort of petri dish lab-based studies, observational studies where you look at a population, prospective studies where you follow a population across time, and even some randomized controlled trials have consistently shown animal proteins to be associated with chronic disease. But studying the effects of animal protein specifically is not so easy. Why? Well, it's because of the company protein keeps. An animal food doesn't just contain protein, it contains lots of other things like saturated fat, cholesterol, heme iron, and even bacterial endotoxins. And so you're left with the question of saying, if an animal food is associated with poor health outcomes, how do you know whether it's the animal protein or some other part of the food? But even so, in some instances, there do seem to be negative health outcomes associated with the protein specifically, independent of any other components of an animal food. For instance, the Intermap study of thousands of people showed a significant correlation between animal protein and high blood pressure, but not plant protein. And it was noted that these people that were consuming a lot more plant protein had high levels of glutamic acid. This is one of the amino acids that make up protein in their urine. And the more glutamic acid in their urine, the lower their blood pressure. And so it's theorized that glutamic acid, which is found in much higher quantities in plant proteins than animal proteins, is converted into glutathione in the body. And this is a very powerful antioxidant. And this may be responsible for the blood pressure lowering effect of plant proteins. Additionally, we see that animal proteins, far more so than plant proteins, promote a state of what's called metabolic acidosis in the body. They create an acidic environment that our body has to try and neutralize somehow. And it's thought that this chronic acidosis from eating animal proteins continuously could act at a cellular level to potentially encourage cancer formation. Next up, let's look at 48,000 men who were enrolled in the Health Professionals Follow-up Study out of Harvard. Here we see a significant increased risk of colon cancer associated with animal protein. And what was interesting here is that this was seen independent of saturated fat, total fat, and animal fat. What this means is it seems like it's the animal protein specifically that is causing this increased cancer risk. And finally, the amino acid leucine is present in much higher quantities in animal proteins than it is in plant proteins. So high quantities of leucine are thought to interfere with what's known as the mTOR pathway. This is a sort of series of biochemical reactions that leucine seems to interfere with. And when mTOR signaling is disrupted, it opens the door for potentially many chronic diseases, including heart disease and diabetes. So these are some of the ways in which the science suggests, I don't think it's conclusive yet, but certainly it suggests that animal protein specifically has deleterious health effects. But even if it were the case that there are no problems with animal protein specifically, it's fairly academic anyway, because we don't eat animal protein in isolation. Generally, we eat foods that contain animal protein. And so whether it's the protein or something else within the animal food, who really cares? You're eating the food and it's going to have a negative health effect. And in this way, an excessive focus on protein encourages us to eat foods that promote disease. And whether it's the animal protein itself or something else within the meat or dairy becomes an academic discussion that isn't really relevant for day-to-day life. So I think I have to address the question here. How much protein do we actually need? So here's something that might surprise you. If you went and scoured the medical literature, you would be hard-pressed to find even one case of one person who was protein deficient when they were eating an adequate supply of calories from whole foods. You know, sure, if you ate a diet of nothing but refined sugar, you may run into protein problems, although I imagine protein is probably going to be the least of your worries on that diet. Similarly, there is a condition called kwashiorkor, and this is commonly thought of as protein deficiency. But kwashiorkor is more a starvation problem. It always happens when people aren't getting enough food, and it's actually treated by just feeding people, by giving people calories from cereal grains, for instance, and the condition resolves. And so it seems that if you're eating real foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and you're eating sufficient calories for your body's requirements, there may be no such thing as protein deficiency. Let's see if we can make sense of this. Let's take it back. We don't actually need protein specifically, right? We need the amino acids from which our bodies will build the proteins we require. But it turns out we're actually very good recyclers of amino acids. And we can tell this by sort of nitrogen balance studies where you can essentially see how much protein is going in and out. And so we can actually break down proteins that we already have in our body and redeploy those amino acids and build new proteins that we need. So we tend to have plenty of amino acids already in our bodies, either in our muscles or a reserve in our liver. And so it tends to be calories that's the limiting factor behind growth rather than amino acids, rather than protein. Another factor to consider here is the bacteria that live in our guts. These are also a key part of the sort of protein amino acid recycling process. And so healthy gut flora, which we cultivate by eating a variety of different plant foods, may be one of the ways in which we've evolved to always have enough amino acids to meet our needs. And it's even been found that our gut bacteria can produce the 9 essential amino acids that supposedly we can only get through the food that we eat. So it's worth pointing out that all 9 of these essential amino acids that our bodies can't synthesize are present in all whole plant foods, like white potatoes, flour, corn, vegetables, you name it. If you want to see this for yourself, go onto Chronometer and check it out. Now, unfortunately, we're still suffering from a myth that plant proteins are incomplete, or that you need to combine different plant foods to get enough protein or the right ratios of different amino acids. This isn't true. It can actually be traced back to a book from 1971. The author, Francis Moore Lappé, wrote this book, Diet for a Small Planet, which was really focused on world hunger, and it actually convinced many people to become vegetarian. But in it, she promoted this idea that to get enough protein or the right quantity of different amino acids, you had to eat lots of different types and combine them so that you would get the right balance of amino acids. It actually turns out that in later editions of her book, Lappé retracted this statement and regretted that she'd created this myth. She said that humans are virtually guaranteed to get enough protein if they're consuming enough calories. But unfortunately, by that point, the genie was already out of the bottle and this myth was going strong. With respect to the actual amount of protein we need, there's been some controversy in the academic literature here. You can come to different answers using different methods, for example, nitrogen balance studies versus amino acid oxidation studies. But ultimately, it seems like it's a completely academic question that is not really relevant for you or I. After all, most everyone gets plenty of protein, way more than the recommended daily amount as it's currently stated. So perhaps a better question than how much protein do we need is how little protein can we get away with to be healthy? You know, with nutrition, there's an implicit assumption that it's better to have too much than too little. When it comes to things like vitamins, this seems to make a lot of sense. But it may well break down when it comes to things like protein. And it certainly breaks down with calories. For example, too little obviously could lead to starvation, but too many leads to obesity. Or even iron. Too little leads to things like anemia, but too much can cause inflammation and oxidative stress. And given the health consequences of animal protein, it would certainly appear that less is better than more. I think there's a good analogy here that Dr. Davis uses in Proteinaholic. Imagine protein or amino acids like the bricks you'd use to build a house. You need a certain number of bricks to build it. And occasionally, you know, a brick will get worn out and you might need to replace it. But when you're building a house, is more and more bricks always better? At some point, you're going to have enough bricks, and just adding more and more doesn't make the house any better. In fact, it might actually do harm because then you've got loads of bricks lying around that you can't do anything with. That's the difference between enough protein, enough to build the house, and excess protein when you've just got more protein than you can possibly use. And in fact, you have to find a way to then get rid of. And this can actually put a strain on our kidneys as they work to remove all that extra protein that we can't use. And at this point, I've got to point out that plant protein, whilst it doesn't have the same risks associated with it as animal protein does, there doesn't seem to be any great benefit to having more either. So when you see vegan food products, for instance, boasting about their protein content, what they're doing is capitalizing on that health halo effect that's been created by the decades of marketing that's gone before them. They might think, you know, if the hard work has already been done of educating consumers about protein by the animal product industry, well, why not capitalize on it? So true, extra plant protein is not harmful, but neither is it really helpful. So it's, again, more about marketing than it is about science. So how low can we actually go with our protein and be healthy? Well, there's a couple of interesting points here. One study from back in the 1920s that fed people a diet of pretty much just potatoes, a little bit of animal fat, but they were getting all their protein from potatoes. Now, potatoes are only 7% protein, and they were on this diet for 6 months, and yet they seemed to be in good health at the end of the 6 months. Perhaps the most extreme test of trying to make someone protein deficient that people have done voluntarily is being a fruitarian endurance athlete. So there are certain people that only eat raw fruit and yet participate in in endurance athletic events. Most fruits average around 5% of their calories coming from protein. So if you were to ever find a protein deficiency that wasn't also a calorie deficiency, it would surely be in raw fruitarian athletes. And yet even these people seem to be in good health and seem to be getting adequate protein. So whilst fruit is low in protein, it does still have those amino acids. And since our bodies are so good at recycling those amino acids, and our gut bacteria play their role, we really don't seem to be able to not get enough protein. It's practically impossible to design a protein deficient diet that isn't also a starvation diet. There is this evidence that high protein diets can actually be harmful, especially in the elderly. Now, there's very little evidence that elderly people need more protein than younger people. But on the contrary, excess protein could be more toxic to elderly people because their kidneys can't clear it and process it fast enough. So what is the bottom line when it comes to the question of how much protein do we need? For the vast majority of us, I think the answer should be, don't worry about it. Eat whole plant foods, you'll get enough protein. If you really like counting or you want to be extra sure, you could aim for the recommended daily amount of protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of lean body mass. Now that's not total body mass, remember, only lean, so your sort of fat-free body mass. Now, if you are an elite athlete or a bodybuilder, there is evidence that a little more protein may be beneficial. Now, don't use that as an excuse to think, oh, well, I'm an elite athlete, I need to be chugging down protein shakes every day. If you're like the vast majority of us, you go to, you exercise a few times a week, that doesn't give us license to just suddenly think we need excessive amounts of protein. If you're the 1 in 100 people that is running a marathon every week, or you're a bodybuilder in the gym every day trying to put on as much mass as you can, as much muscle as you can, yeah, have some more protein. For the rest of us, don't worry about it, just eat healthy foods. So there we have it. I hope this video has made the case to you convincingly that protein's reputation is built on a house of cards. Yes, it is vitally important for our survival. So important that it's present in all of our natural foods in sufficient quantities for our health. It certainly appears that humans have evolved such that as long as we're eating enough calories, there's no way we could become accidentally protein deficient. But an obsession with protein, which we get way more than enough of, to the exclusion of other nutrients like fiber, which almost no one gets even close to enough of, is leading to confusion and disease and nutritional nihilism, where we're just throwing our hands up in the air and saying, well, I'll just eat the protein, I don't care. So I hope this video has given you the insight to stop worrying about protein and instead focus on eating whole plant foods, complete with their rich variety of nutrients, tastes, and textures. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, I have a free gift to offer you. I'd like to give you my 5 principles of health. This is a simple one-page summary of perhaps the 5 simplest, most critical things that we can be doing to get our health on track for the long term. If that would be helpful to you, please feel free to click on the link in the description below. It is all yours. And if this video has been informative and helpful for you, then I have another video that I've made that I think will be similarly very interesting and helpful for you. It's my review of the book Whole by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. If you would like to watch that, you can click right here. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.